Welcome back. After Premier Barry O'Farrell, we go to the sublime, the ridiculous, some might say. Here is Joel Fitzgibbon, the Shadow Minister for Agriculture in the Canberra studio. G'day, Joel.
Good to be with you, Richo.
Now, I want to ask you a few questions about the drought. I mean, I hope you heard the end of what I was talking to the Premier about, because obviously, I mean, you're Robinson Crusoe. You're about the last Labor member left with a rural seat, aren't you? I think. Is there anybody else? I'm scratching mine. There are not too many, are there?
One of two, Richo. A very fine individual by the name of Shane Newman, just around the Ipswich area in Queensland, holds what the AEC defines as a rural seat.
Oh, well, there you go. There's two of you. Okay, well, I apologise for the error, but you've got, you know, the Hunter Valley or parts of it in your. I think you go to Denman and places like that, don't you? Your electorate, so it's got a fair rural component. How is it there?
Well, I go well beyond Denman. I've got 20,000 square kilometres that stretches right up to the Liverpool Range and right around west to Candos and Rolleston, Cassilis, Merriwar, all of those areas, and like just about everywhere on the eastern seaboard, the situation is very bad and growing worse by the week.
Yeah, how is it that this has almost escaped urban people's notice? I mean, it's really only the last 2 to 3 weeks that I've noticed the papers giving it a run.
Well, I'm not sure it's entirely escaped their notice. I mean, you know, politicians are down there with used car salesmen, and farmers are up there with ambos and nurses, and people do notice when our people on the land are doing it tough. They understand they provide our food and our food security, and they do have sympathy for them. But the severe onslaught of this drought has been pretty rapid, and it's been growing worse very quickly on a week-by-week basis. And despite some prediction of some rain this coming weekend, pretty broad rain and pretty heavy rain, I think the problem is going to be with us for some time to come yet.
Well, I read today that there's a fair chance we're going into another El Nino, which has got to make these things worse. But what's the solution? I mean, I noticed that there are public appeals, and they're going to be sending hay to some of these areas, you know, Cobar and places, and that's terrific. But that's not going to fix a problem this widespread. How do you keep our cattle alive for a start? Because there are so many of them that it seems to me over the next few weeks will be shot.
Yeah, well, Barry O'Farrell is right. We've been going through a reform process now for some time, and that is the right direction to go in public policy terms, working on drought proofing rather than what we do in drought, having farmers better prepare for drought. The problem is, of course, you can't prepare for an event like this. This is the equivalent of an earthquake, a cyclone, or whatever, and no matter how hard a farmer might try and how much money they might put aside through farm management deposits, for example, you can't be properly prepared for this sort of event. So we need to continue the reform progress and move on now to a national emergency or national disaster type payment which cuts in when we have situations like this. Now, the problem here, of course, is the reform process is only partly done. The Commonwealth reached agreement with the states to get rid of all the old EC arrangements, interest rate subsidies, and a number of other initiatives, and we are still in that process. The problem is we haven't moved on to the next phase of the reform, that is adopting what comes next. Typically, in my view and in the view of the former government, a national emergency type payment. And unfortunately, and I'm pretty careful not to make this too big a political issue, but 6 months in, the new government hasn't progressed that reform program. In fact, they've abolished the COAG committee, which is the vehicle for progressing that reform.
So it's about grants to you. I mean, it seems to me, having talked to a few people on the land, that one of the great problems, and I mentioned it to the Premier before, was this question of finance. You know, what the banks are doing for them. Now, would it be possible to get some funds from the Commonwealth and the states, and maybe, you know, hit the Commonwealth Bank and the others, they seem to have a quid or two at the moment, and have some funds where you can actually refinance some of these people? Because it seems to me that that's one of the great difficulties they have.
Well, in fact, because the government hasn't moved on to replace the old EC arrangements, the government is in effect saving money, avoiding the payments it would be making if the EC arrangements were in place. Now, we used to have a heavy reliance on interest rate subsidies. The problem with interest rate subsidies is that they just encourage some farmers to borrow more money when they're in trouble, getting them further into debt. Now, people are talking about a rural bank or a reconstruction bank. In fact, there is a vehicle in place right now that Barnaby Joyce and Tony Abbott could use tomorrow. It's called the Farm Finance Scheme, And it was put in by the former Labor government, $420 million over 2 years. Rather than encourage more debt, it allows farmers to apply to move their debt off the books of a commercial bank onto the books of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth holds the debt for 5 years, and it charges only 4.5%, and it charges interest only, which is an enormous cash flow saving for a farm business. Now, that mechanism is in place. All the government needs to do now is, I think, further reduce the interest rate, so the differential between the commercial rate and the farm finance rate is greater, and adjust the guidelines. We were very careful to ensure that only farms that were viable in the long term, without the advent of a particular event, whether it be drought or otherwise, were eligible for this scheme. I think we just need to adjust the guidelines to lower the bar a little, so if you're drought affected in a natural disaster type situation, you are eligible for that payment. Now that means the government will have to put more money into farm finance, but not the billions of dollars some people are talking about. For example, of course, you could double the scheme for an extra $420 million over 2 years.
Well, if it comes to that, as against paid parental leave schemes, I'll put my hand up. It seems to me to be a really good idea. I just hope someone takes it up, because I don't think we've got a lot of time for people to move on this. There are people suffering now, and of course, that you hear these stories of suicides and things on farms, which is really tragic, and we have to move fast. Can I ask you then? Can I just broaden the discussion? This has been a big week in Australia. You've had the closure of the car industry. Basically, it's now shutting in 2017, and of course you've got a Royal Commission into trade unions. Do you believe that the trade unions were any sort of factor in the closure of Toyota, or Holden and/or Ford?
Can I just say, Drought, the other thing the government needs is to relax the guidelines, the means testing on the farm fair allowance. So it's easier if you're holding some assets on property to get that payment. On Holden, do I blame the unions? No, I don't. And obviously, Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister, is trying to shift the focus here onto the unions as a means of shifting the focus off his own failure to intervene. And, there are powerful arguments, as you know, Richo, on either side of industry welfare. I think the starting point should always be no, and you look at these things on a case-by-case basis. SPC was a perfect example where a very strong case has been made out. And the automotive industry is so significant in the Australian economy and involves so many jobs, and we look at it in the context of no country in the world really fails to prop up an industry like auto, and I think there is a case here for the government to do more.
Well, I mean, it just seems to me that it's SPC, I'd known maybe one case, but I don't think we were ever going to keep the car industry going. One last question, because they tell me I've got 1 minute. The Royal Commission, I don't support it, I know you don't. Why can't Labor support the reintroduction of the Australian Building and Construction Commission?
Well, Richo, this is now becoming a smokescreen. It's quite clear that Tony Abbott has a much broader agenda than the resurrection of that commission. And it's about what is fair here and what is due process and what is necessary to deal with those who may or may not be doing the wrong thing in this sector. That's the key issue for the Labor Party.
Yeah, but it just seems to me that the ABCC did a reasonable job. I think it was the wrong decision to abolish it, even though I probably would have supported it at the time. But you just look at what's happened since and you say to yourself, wow, there's so much wrong in that industry, we've got to do something. But I've got to do something too, which is leave it now, Joel. Thank you very much for your time. I think that the ideas you have about that $420 million seem to me to be pretty good. Let's hope the government does take it on and increase it. Then something good might happen for those farm folk, and I think all of us have their hearts going out to them. Thank you very much for your time. I'll be back in just a moment with